She has written on topics, really important topics, such as the public sphere and politics of recognition and distribution, which is having her writing on this topic are having such a deep impact on so many of us. The term progressive neoliberalism has become very widely referenced. The ecological crisis, etc. Many of her essays have come out in the New Left Review and Critical Historical Studies. Her newest book, Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, co-authored with Rahel Jaeggi, was published by Polity Press in 2018, but she has another book coming out, which seems really interesting. Feminism for the 99%, which is a co-authored manifesto, which is to come out in several languages in the winter. So, very interesting. Her work has been translated in 20 languages. If you're very curious, you can go on her website and you will see a really, really long list of prizes and awards and endowed lectures she's given. I'm not going to give you the full list. I will simply mention that she is a past president of the American Philosophical Association, and that she has delivered the Tanner Lecture in Human Values at Stanford. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nancy.
Well, I don't think I'm using this, am I? Anyway, thank you so much, Michelle, for that very generous introduction and for inviting me to deliver this very prestigious lecture. It's a little bit daunting, especially the part about promoting world peace. But, and I'm not at all sure that what I have to say qualifies. It might be more about promoting class struggle. But anyway, let me give you what I have here. And I want to start with what I hope you will agree is a very banal proposition, namely, we are currently facing a severe crisis of democracy. I suspect that few of you would dispute that proposition. I think it's widely enough understood. What might be less well understood, however, are you hearing an echo or is this okay? I feel like every time I go down, it's okay? Good, all right. What may be less well understood is that this crisis is not freestanding. Its sources do not lie exclusively in the political realm. Contra current bien-pensant common sense, this crisis cannot be resolved by restoring civility, by cultivating bipartisanship, by opposing political tribalism, or by reinstating truth-oriented, fact-based discourse. Nor, contra recent democratic theory, can our political crisis be solved by reforming the political realm, not by strengthening the democratic ethos, by reactivating the constituent power, by unleashing the force of agonism, or by fostering democratic iterations, to mention a few key words of current political theory discourse. In my view, all of those proposals fall prey to an error that I am going to call politicism. And I define politicism by analogy to an error that many of you will already be familiar with, namely economism. Politicist thinking, I'm saying, overlooks the causal force of extra-political society, treating the political order as if it were self-determining and failing to problematize the larger social matrix that generates its deformations. In fact, in my view, democracy's present crisis is firmly anchored in a social matrix. It represents one strand of a broader and more far-reaching crisis, which also encompasses other strands, ecological, economic, and social, to name a few. Inextricably entwined with these others, the political crisis cannot be understood in isolation from them. Neither freestanding nor merely sectoral, today's democratic ills form the specifically political strand of what historians would call a general crisis. That is, a crisis that is engulfing our social order in its entirety. Their underlying bases lie in the sinews of that social order, in the latter's institutional structures and constitutive dynamics. Bound up with processes that transcend the political, democratic crisis can only be grasped by a critical perspective on, if I may use an unfashionable term, the social totality. What exactly is this social totality? Many astute observers identify it with neoliberalism, and not without reason. It is true, as Colin Crouch maintains, that democratic governments are now outgunned, if not wholly captured, by oligopolistic corporations with a global reach, lately liberated from political control. It is also true, as Wolfgang Streeck contends, that democracy's decline in the global north coincides with a coordinated tax revolt of corporate capital and with the installation of global financial markets as the new sovereigns that elected governments must obey. Nor can one dispute Wendy Brown's claim that democratic power is being hollowed out from within by neoliberal political rationalities that valorize efficiency and choice, and by modes of subjectivation that enjoin self-responsibilization and maximization of one's human capital. Finally, I think Stephen Gill is right to insist that democratic action is being preempted by what he calls a new constitutionalism that locks in neoliberal macroeconomic policy transnationally through treaties such as NAFTA, including the new improved version, which enshrine free trade strictures as political trumps and foreclose robust social and environmental legislation in the public interest. Whether taken individually or read together, these accounts convey the entirely plausible idea that what threatens our democracy is neoliberalism. Nevertheless, the problem runs deeper. Neoliberalism is, after all, a form of capitalism, and today's democratic crisis is by no means capitalism's first, nor is it likely, if capitalism persists, to be the last. On the contrary, every major phase of capitalist development has given rise to and been transformed by political turmoil. Mercantile capitalism was periodically roiled and eventually destroyed by a slew of peripheral slave revolts and metropolitan democratic revolutions. Its laissez-faire successor racked up a solid century and a half of political turbulence, including multiple socialist revolutions and fascist putches, 2 world wars, and countless anti-colonial uprisings, before giving way in the inter- and post-war era to state-managed capitalism, or social democratic capitalism if you prefer. The latter regime was itself no stranger to political crisis, having weathered a massive wave of anti-colonial rebellions, a global New Left uprising, a Cold War, and a nuclear arms race, before finally succumbing to the long process of neoliberal subversion, which ushered in our current regime of globalizing financialized capitalism. This history casts the present democratic crisis in a larger light. Neoliberalism's political travails, however acute, represent the latest chapter of a longer story, which concerns the political vicissitudes of capitalism as such. Not just neoliberalism, but capitalism is prone to political crisis, and I'll try to suggest inimical to democracy. Hang on a minute, yeah. That, in any case, is the thesis I'm going to try to argue here. Treating democracy's present crisis as one strand of a larger general crisis, I shall construe the object of that crisis as capitalist society in its present neoliberal form. But I shall also argue the stronger thesis that every form of capitalism harbors a deep-seated political contradiction which inclines it to political crisis. Like capitalism's other contradictions, economic, ecological, and social, about which I'll say more very shortly, this one is inscribed in its DNA. Far from representing an anomaly, the democratic crisis we experience today is the form this contradiction assumes in capitalism's present phase, which I'm going to call financialized capitalism. Now, my thesis rests on enlarged understandings of capitalism and of capitalist crisis, and I need to explain those to you now. Many left-wing thinkers, including most Marxists, understand capitalism narrowly as an economic system simpliciter, focused on contradictions internal to its economy, such as the falling rate of profit in one orthodox version. They equate capitalist crisis with economic system dysfunctions, such as depressions, bankruptcy chains, and market crashes leading to mass unemployment. The effect is to preclude a full accounting of capitalism's crisis tendencies, omitting its non-economic contradictions and forms of crisis. What are excluded, above all, are crises grounded in what I am going to call inter-realm contradictions, contradictions that arise when capitalism's economic imperatives collide with the reproduction imperatives of its non-economic realms and thereby destabilize them. Realms, I should add, whose health is essential to ongoing accumulations as well as to human well-being. An example is what I've called elsewhere the social reproductive contradiction of capitalist society. Marxists, again, to begin with them, have rightly located the secret of accumulation in the hidden abode of commodity production where capital exploits wage labor. But they have not always fully appreciated that this process rests on the even more hidden abode of unwaged care work, often performed by women, which forms and replenishes the human subjects who constitute labor. Deeply dependent on such social reproductive activities, capital nonetheless accords them no value, meaning no monetized value, the only kind it recognizes, treats them in effect as free and infinitely available, and assumes no responsibility for sustaining them. Left to itself, therefore, and given its relentless drive to limitless accumulation, it is always in danger of destabilizing the very processes and capacities for social reproduction on which it depends. Another example of inter-realm contradiction is ecological. On the one hand, the accumulation of capital relies on nature, both as a so-called tap, which supplies material and energetic inputs to commodity production, and also as a sink for absorbing the latter's waste. On the other hand, capital also disavows the ecological costs it generates, effectively assuming that nature can replenish itself autonomously and without end. So in this case, too, capitalism's economy tends to eat its own tail, destabilizing the very natural conditions on which it relies. In both cases, an inter-realm contradiction grounds a proclivity to a type of capitalist crisis that transcends the economic. Social reproductive crisis in one case, ecological crisis in the other, and I would add parenthetically that we're in the midst of the throes of both of those strands of crisis at the present moment. Now, these considerations suggest an enlarged understanding of what capitalism is, no longer a mere economy, but an institutionalized social order, Above and beyond the economic subsystem, capitalist society also encompasses, or should be conceived as also encompassing, the non-economic realms that support its economy, here so far, social reproduction and non-human nature. As such, it harbors a plurality of crisis tendencies, not just those stemming from intra-economic contradictions, but also those based in inter-realm contradictions between economy and society on the one hand, between economy and nature on the other. If you like, you could call these not Marxian, but Polanyian contradictions. Okay, this enlarged understanding also affords a way, I'm going to suggest, of understanding democracy's present travails, an understanding that allows us to escape the trap of politicism. No longer seen as freestanding, these political travails appear as expressions of a further political strand of capitalist crisis, grounded in yet another inter-realm contradiction, a political contradiction between the imperatives of capital accumulation on the one hand and the maintenance of the public powers on which accumulation also depends. Let me spell it out quickly in a nutshell before I proceed to elaborate. Legitimate, efficacious public power is a condition of possibility for sustained capital accumulation. I'll explain why momentarily. Yet, capitalism's drive to endless accumulation tends, over the long haul, to destabilize the very public powers on which it depends. On this view, today's democratic crisis would be a strand of capitalist crisis whose broader contours supply the key to its resolution. Now, I'll pursue this hypothesis by noting first the obvious, that capital relies on public powers to establish and enforce its constitutive norms. Accumulation is inconceivable, obviously, in the absence of a legal framework underpinning private enterprise and market exchange. It depends crucially on public powers to guarantee property rights, enforce contracts, and adjudicate disputes, to suppress rebellions, maintain order, and manage dissent, to sustain the monetary regimes that constitute capital's lifeblood, to undertake efforts, when needed, to forestall or manage crises, and to codify and enforce the status hierarchies that distinguish citizens from aliens, also free exploitable workers who are entitled to sell their labor power, from dependent expropriable others whose assets can simply be seized. I'll come back to that point later too. Now, historically, the public powers in question have mostly been lodged in territorial states, including those that have operated as colonial powers. It was the legal systems of such states that established the contours of seemingly depoliticized arenas within which private powers could pursue their economic interests free from political interference. Likewise, it was territorial states that mobilized the legitimate force to put down resistance to the expropriations through which capitalist property relations were originated and sustained. Then too, it was national states that conferred subjective rights upon some and denied them to others. It was such states, finally, that nationalized and underwrote money. Having thus constituted the capitalist economy, these political powers subsequently augmented capital's capacity to rack up profits and face down challenges. They built and maintained infrastructure, compensated for market failures, steered economic development, bolstered social reproduction, mitigated economic crises, and managed the associated political fallout. But that is not all. A capitalist economy also has political conditions of possibility at the geopolitical level. What is at issue here is the organization of the broader space in which territorial states are embedded. Now, this is a space in which capital would seem to move quite easily given its inherent expansionist thrust and its deep-seated drive to siphon value from peripheral regions to its core. But its ability to operate across borders, to expand through international trade, and to profit from the predation of subjugated peoples, all this depends not only on national or imperial political might, but also on transnational political arrangements, on international law, brokered agreements among the great powers, supranational regimes that partially pacify a realm that is sometimes imagined as a state of nature. Throughout its history, capitalism's economy has also depended on the military and organizational capacities of a succession of global hegemons, which have sought to foster accumulation on a progressively expanding scale within the framework of a multi-state political system. At both levels then, the state territorial and the geopolitical, the capitalist economy is deeply indebted to political powers external to it. These non-economic powers are indispensable to all the major streams of accumulation, to the exploitation of free labor and the production and exchange of commodities, to the expropriation of racialized subject peoples and the siphoning of value from periphery to core, to the organization of finance, space, and knowledge, hence to the accrual of interest and rent. In no way peripheral adjuncts, political forces, like the ones we discussed earlier, social reproductive capacities and non-human nature, are constitutive elements of capitalist society. Essential to its functioning, public power is part and parcel of the institutionalized social order that is capitalism. But the maintenance of public power stands in a tense relation with the imperative of capital accumulation. The reason lies in capitalism's distinctive institutional topography, which separates the economic from the political. In this respect, capitalist societies differ from earlier forms in which those instances were effectively fused, as for example in feudal society, where control over labor, land, and military force was vested in the single institution of lordship and vassalage. In capitalist societies, by contrast, economic power and political power are split apart. Each is assigned its own sphere, endowed with its own distinctive medium and modus operandi. The power to organize production is privatized and devolved to capital, which is supposed to deploy only the natural, non-political sanctions of hunger and need. The task of governing the non-economic orders, including those external conditions for accumulation, falls to the public power, which alone may utilize the political media of law and legitimate violence. In capitalism, therefore, the economic is non-political and the political is non-economic. Definitive of what capitalism is, this separation is often used to drastically limit the scope of the political, devolving vast aspects of social life to the rule of what's called the market, but which in reality means to large corporations. It declares those questions off limits to democratic decision-making, collective action, and public control. By its very structure, in other words, the system deprives us of the ability to decide collectively exactly what and how much to produce, on what energetic basis, and through what kinds of social relations. It deprives us, too, of the capacity to determine how we want to use the social surplus we collectively produce, how we should relate to nature and to future generations, how we shall organize the work of social reproduction and its relation to that of production. Capitalism, in sum, is at a deep level fundamentally anti-democratic, and democracy in a capitalist society, although it may exist, must perforce be limited and weak. But that is not all. Capitalist democracy must also be shaky and insecure, subject to destabilization, as capital tries to have it both ways. On the one hand, it freeloads off of public power availing itself of the legal regimes that secure private property, of the repressive forces that suppress opposition, of the infrastructures it needs for the work of accumulation, and of the regulatory agencies tasked with managing crisis. At the same time, the thirst for profit periodically tempts at least some fractions of the capitalist class to rebel against public power, which they badmouth as inferior to markets and scheme to weaken. In such cases, when short-term interests trump long-term survival, capital is like a tiger that eats its own tail, threatening to destroy the very political institutions that it itself needs. I would like to encapsulate this argument, this problem I've been sketching, in 4 words that begin with D, a kind of little mnemonic, if you like. The first is division. Capitalist societies divide their economies from their organized political power, while secondly, making their economies depend, second D word, on the political powers in order to run. But third, because capital recognizes only monetized forms of value, it free rides on public goods and public powers, while, here's the third D word, disavowing their replacement costs. Geared to endless accumulation, finally, capitalism's economy is primed periodically to, fourth D word, destabilize the very political powers that it itself needs. So I'm suggesting that together, these 4 D words spell out a political contradiction that is lodged deep in the institutional structure of capitalist societies. Like the economic contradictions that Marxists have stressed, this one too grounds a crisis tendency. In this case, however, the crisis tendency is not located inside the economy, but rather at the join, at the border that simultaneously separates and connects economy and polity in capitalist society. So it's a Polanyian contradiction as opposed to a Marxian one. Inherent in capitalism as such, this inter-realm contradiction inclines every form of capitalist society to political crisis, or so I claim. Now, of course, what I've said here to this point elaborates the structure of a political crisis tendency for capitalism as such. But yet, as you know, capitalist society does not exist as such, but only in historically specific forms, or as they've often been called, regimes of accumulation. And capitalism's constitutive division between the economic and the political is not given once and for all, but is subject to contestation and change. Especially in periods of acute overt crisis, social actors struggle over the boundaries delimiting economy from polity, and sometimes they succeed in redrawing them. In the 20th century, for example, sharpening class conflict forced states to take on new responsibilities for promoting employment and economic growth. In the early 21st century, by contrast, partisans of the so-called free market have altered the international rules of the road in ways that strongly incentivize states to abandon such efforts. The result in both cases was to revise previously established boundaries between economy and polity. So that division has mutated several times in the course of capitalism's history, as have the public powers that made accumulation possible at every stage. I've called these struggles over the boundary struggles. And I think that the shifts that they have produced mark some epochal transformations of capitalist society throughout its history. If we adopt a perspective that foregrounds these shifts, we can distinguish 4 regimes of accumulation in capitalism's history. First, an early modern regime of mercantile capitalism, then running roughly from the 16th to the 18th centuries, then a 19th century regime of liberal competitive capitalism, third, a 20th century regime of state-managed, sometimes called monopoly or social democratic capitalism, and of course, the current regime of globalizing financialized capitalism. In each case, the political conditions for the capitalist economy have assumed a different institutional form at both the state territorial level and the geopolitical level. In each case, too, the political contradiction of capitalist society has assumed a different guise and found expression in a different set of crisis phenomena. In each regime, finally, capitalism's political contradiction has incited different forms of social struggle. I want now to consider very, very briefly, in a kind of potted history, the way these dynamics might be seen to have played out in the first three regimes before turning in more detail to the current regime. So let's consider first capitalism's initial mercantile phase, which, as I say, held sway for a couple of hundred years, roughly from the 16th to the 18th centuries. In this phase, capitalism's economy was only partially separated from the state. Neither land nor labor was a true commodity, and moral economic norms still governed most everyday interactions, even in the towns and cities of the European heartland. Absolutist rulers used their powers to regulate commerce internally within their territories, even as they profited from external plunder, which was effected through military force, and from long-distance trade, which was organized capitalistically through an expanding world market in slaves and luxury commodities. The result was an internal-external division, commercial regulation inside the national territory, the law of value outside it. Now, this division held for a while, but it turned out to be unsustainable in the long run. It was eventually breached as the value logic that operated internationally began to penetrate the domestic space of European states, altering the social relations among landowners and their dependents, and fostering new professional and business milieu in urban centers, which became seedbeds of liberal and even revolutionary thinking. Equally corrosive and consequential was the rising indebtedness of rulers. Needing revenue, some of them were forced to convene proto-parliamentary bodies, which they could not in the end control, and that led, in several cases, to revolution. Now, thanks to this combination of economic corrosion and political turmoil, mercantile capitalism was supplanted in the 19th century by a new regime, which is often called liberal or laissez-faire capitalism, although those terms are highly misleading, as we shall see. In this phase, the economy-polity nexus was dramatically reconfigured. Leading European capitalist states no longer used public power directly to regulate internal commerce. Rather, they constructed these strange new things, economies, in which production and exchange appeared to operate autonomously, free from overt political control, through the supposedly purely economic mechanism of supply and demand. What underlay that construction, of course, was a new legal order, which enshrined the supremacy of contract, private property, price-setting markets, and the associated subjective rights of free individuals viewed, for this purpose at least, as utility-maximizing arm's-length transactors. The effect was to institutionalize, at least at the national level, a seemingly sharp division between the public power of states on the one hand and the private power of capital on the other. But of course, states were all the while using repressive power to sanctify the land expropriations that transformed rural populations into what Marx called doubly free proletarians, free to sell their labor power, but freed from access to the means of production and subsistence. In this way, the states established the class preconditions for the large-scale exploitation of wage labor, which, when combined with fossilized energy, powered a massive takeoff of industrial manufacturing. The resulting social revolution soon led to political revolution. Now I have to see if I can read my handwritten addendum here. As Chartists demanded the vote for working men, Chartists among others, and eventually won a system-conforming version of citizenship. It must be noted that in the periphery, no such accommodation or class compromise was forthcoming. On the contrary, European colonial powers dropped every pretense of political abstinence there, marshaling military might to underwrite wholesale looting of subjugated populations. They consolidated colonial rule on the basis of the so-called free trade imperialism established under British hegemony. All of which, I mean to say, raises doubts about the expression liberal capitalism. From virtually the start, moreover, this regime was racked by instability, both economic and political. Its way of institutionalizing the economy-polity separation gave rise, on the economic side, to periodic depressions, crashes, and panics, and on the political side, to intense class conflicts, boundary struggles of the sort I've suggested. We think about Polanyi's double movement, for example, and revolutions. All the while fueling international financial chaos, anti-colonial rebellions, and inter-imperialist wars. Once again, the scale, let's say, of economy and polity did not fully align. In any case, by the 20th century, the multiple contradictions of so-called liberal capitalism had metastasized into a protracted general crisis, which was finally resolved, this is the period Polanyi wrote about, finally resolved in the aftermath of World War II with the installation of a new regime. In this new state-managed capitalist regime, the states of the core began to use public power more proactively within their own territories to forestall or mitigate crisis. Empowered by the Bretton Woods system of capital controls, which had been established under US hegemony, they invested in infrastructure, assumed some costs of social reproduction, promoted full employment and working class consumerism, accepted labor unions as partners in trilateral corporatist bargaining, actively steered economic development, compensated for market failures, and generally disciplined capital for its own good. While broadening the purview of politics, these measures were largely aimed, also, at securing the conditions for sustained capital accumulation, in part by preempting militant mass mobilizations and revolution. They stabilized matters for several decades, but at a cost. Arrangements that delivered some gains to majority ethnicity industrial workers in the capitalist core rested on some further not so nice hidden abodes, on women's dependency through the family wage, on racial ethnic exclusions from social entitlements, and on ongoing imperial expropriation in what was then called the Third World. The latter proceeded by old means and new even after decolonization, severely limiting the capacities of newly independent states to stabilize their societies and steer development. The effect was to plant some ticking time bombs whose detonation would eventually converge with other processes to bring down this regime. In the end, state-managed capitalism ran up against its own contradictions, both economic and political. Rising wages and generalization of productivity gains combined to lower profit rates in manufacturing in the core, prompting new efforts on the part of capital to unshackle market forces from political regulation. And a global new left erupted to challenge the oppressions, exclusions, and predations on which the whole edifice rested. What followed was a protracted period of crisis. I'm talking now mainly about the 1970s and onward, at times acute, at times slow boiling, during which the state-managed capitalist settlement was stealthily supplanted, not in a dramatic way as in some of the other cases, interestingly, but stealthily supplanted by the present regime of financialized capitalism, to which I now turn. Financialized capitalism remakes the economy-polity relation yet again. In this regime, central banks and global financial institutions have in many respects, if not all, replaced states as the principal arbiters of an increasingly globalized economy. It is they, not states, who now make the rules that govern the central relations of capitalist society between labor and capital, citizens and states, core and periphery, and, crucial for all of the above, between debtors and creditors. These last relations are central to financialized capitalism and penetrate all the others. It is largely through debt that capital now cannibalizes labor, disciplines states, transfers wealth from periphery to core, and sucks value from society and nature. As debt flows through states, regions, communities, households, and firms, the result is a dramatic shift in the relation of economy to polity. The previous regime had empowered states to subordinate the short-term interests of private firms to the long-term objective of sustained accumulation. By contrast, this one authorizes finance capital to discipline states and publics in the immediate interests of private investors. The effect is a kind of double whammy. On the one hand, the state institutions that were previously at least somewhat responsive to citizens are decreasingly capable of solving the latter's problems or meeting their needs. On the other hand, the central banks and global financial institutions that have hobbled state capacities are, as they proudly boast, politically independent, meaning unaccountable to publics and free to act on behalf of investors and creditors. Meanwhile, the scale of pressing problems, such as global warming, far exceeds the reach and heft of existing public powers. The latter are, in any case, overmatched by transnational corporations and global financial flows, which elude control by political agencies tethered to a bounded territory. And the general result is a growing incapacity of public powers to rein in private powers. Hence the association of financialized capitalism, or as some would call it, neoliberalism, with so-called de-democratization and post-democracy. The shift to a regime centered on accumulation through debt arose through a major restructuring of the international order, including the dismantling of the Bretton Woods framework of capital controls, fixed exchange rates, and convertibility to gold, on the one hand, and the repurposing of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as agents of economic liberalization, on the other hand. Both moves that were pushed by the United States and that have served to prolong its hegemony despite some peculiar things like becoming a debtor nation and losing a lot of its moral credibility, let's say. And there soon followed the US-led assault on the developmental state, first via the Washington Consensus and then via structural adjustment. As liberalization was imposed at the gunpoint of debt throughout much of the global South, indebted states scrambled for hard currency by opening export processing zones and by promoting labor emigration for the sake of remittances. Meanwhile, the relocation of manufacturing to the semi-periphery empowered capital in at least two respects. First, by instituting a race to the bottom in the South itself, and second, by decimating powerful trade unions in the capitalist core, thereby weakening political support for social democracy. Meanwhile, the abolition of capital controls and the creation of the euro deprived nearly all states of control over their currencies, putting them, the US being the exception, since as world money, it can just print more as it chooses, but otherwise, putting them at the mercy of the bond markets and rating agencies and disabling a critical tool of crisis management. The states of the core were thus thrust into a position long familiar to those of the periphery, subjection to global economic forces they cannot possibly hope to control. One response, as Crouch has taught us, was the policy shift from public Keynesianism, based on tax and spend, if you like, to privatized Keynesianism, which encouraged consumer debt to promote continued high levels of consumer spending under otherwise unfavorable conditions of falling real wages, rising unemployment and precarity, and declining tax revenues. The effect, as we know, was the 2007-08 financial crisis, which only solidified the hold of private creditors over public power. Having orchestrated sovereign debt crises, central banks and global financial institutions compelled states under assault by bond markets to institute austerity, which meant sacrificing the interests of their citizens to those of international lenders. The European Union, once considered the avatar of post-national democracy, rushed to do the bidding of the bankers and investors, forfeiting its claim to democratic legitimacy in the eyes of many. Generally, too, financialized capitalism is the era, as we're told, of governance without government, which I have to say, in my view, means domination without the fig leaf of consent. In this regime, it is not states, but transnational governance structures, the EU, the WTO, NAFTA, the TRIPS, et cetera, which make the lion's share of the coercively enforceable rules that now govern vast swaths of social interaction throughout the world. Accountable to no one and acting overwhelmingly in the interests of capital, these bodies, again using Gill's term, are constitutionalizing neoliberal notions of free trade and intellectual property, hardwiring them into the global regime and preempting democratic, labor, and environmental legislation at the domestic level in advance. Through a variety of means, finally, this regime has promoted the capture of public power by private corporate power, while also colonizing the latter internally, modeling its modus operandi on that of private firms. I would highly recommend Nancy MacLean's excellent book on the Virginia School public choice theory. What is it called? Democracy in Chains? Yeah, great book. And one should also look at the work of Foucauldian scholars like Wendy Brown and others who have used the framework of governmentality to describe this neoliberal political rationality very, very well. The overall effect, I'm suggesting, has been to hollow out public power at every level. Political agendas are everywhere narrowed, both by external fiat, that is the demands of the market, the new constitutionalism, and by internal co-optation, corporate capture, privatization, the spread of neoliberal political rationality. Matters once considered to be squarely within the purview of democratic political action are now declared off limits and devolved to the markets, to the benefit of finance and corporate capital. And woe unto those who object. The current regime brazenly targets any public powers and political forces that might challenge this new settlement. It has no qualms about nullifying elections and referenda that reject austerity, as, for example, in Greece in 2015. And it's equally willing to prevent elections that might choose an anti-austerity path, as in the developments in Brazil in 2017, 2018. Throughout the world, leading capitalist interests, big fruit, big pharma, big oil, big arms, maybe one should add big data, are still systematically promote authoritarianism and repression, imperialism and war in ways that never grow old. Witness Yemen, Honduras, et cetera, et cetera. So, in general, what I'm suggesting is that the present regime of accumulation has spawned a crisis of democratic governance. But far from being freestanding, this crisis is grounded in the contradictory, self-destabilizing dynamics of capitalist societies. What some call our democratic deficit is actually the historically specific form that capitalism's inherent political contradiction assumes in its present phase, when runaway financialization inundates the political realm, diminishing its powers to the point that it cannot solve pressing problems, including those such as global warming, that endanger long-term prospects for accumulation, not to mention life as we know it on this planet. In this phase of capitalism, as in every other, democratic crisis is not merely sectoral, but an aspect of a larger crisis complex, which also has other aspects, ecological, as I've said, social, reproductive, and economic. Inextricably entwined with these other strands, our present democratic crisis is part and parcel of the general crisis of financialized capitalism. It cannot be resolved short of resolving that general crisis, hence without some transformation of the economy-polity relation, not to mention the economy-nature relation, the economy-society relation. Nonetheless, there is more to be said. In this lecture, I have considered our present democratic crisis in a one-sided way from a perspective that is pretty much exclusively structural and institutional. But, and that perspective, I think, is absolutely indispensable. But that perspective does not suffice. A crisis, after all, is not simply a logjam in the societal mechanism. Neither an obstruction in the circuits of accumulation nor a blockage in the system of governance merits the label crisis in the true sense. That sense includes not only system impasses, but also the responses to them of social actors. Contra-impoverished systems theoretic understandings, and I hope I'm not misunderstood as having embraced such an understanding, nothing fully counts as a crisis until it is experienced as such. What looks like a crisis to an outside observer does not become historically generative until participants in the society see it as a crisis. Until, for example, they intuit that the pressing problems they experience arise not despite, but precisely because of the established order and cannot be resolved within it. Only then, when a critical mass resolves that that order can and must be transformed by collective action, does an objective impasse gain a subjective voice. Then and only then can we speak of a crisis in the larger sense of a momentous historical crossroads that demands a decision. Reinhard Koselleck, you'll recognize there. Now that is precisely, I believe, what is happening today. No longer merely objective, the political dysfunctions of financialized capitalism have now, I'm tempted to say finally, prompted mass defection from politics as usual. What an earlier observer might have deemed a crisis in itself has now become a crisis for itself. We need only mention the Brexit vote, the election of Donald Trump, and the subsequent unfolding of his presidency, the waxing fortunes of right-wing populist and quasi-fascist parties in Northern and East Central Europe, and now in Latin America with the recent election in Brazil. But also conversely, the strong showing of left-wing populist candidates in Southern Europe, the growing interest in socialism in the United States, and rising support for Jeremy Corbyn's redirecting of the Labour Party in the UK. Different as these are, these phenomena suggest a widespread desire to have done with neoliberalism and with the parties that have enabled it. Rejecting the reigning common sense in political elites, the forces propelling these developments are thinking outside the box, contemplating new perspectives and political projects. The result is a new phase in the gestation of capitalist crisis. A mere conglomeration of system impasses is now a full-blown crisis of hegemony. Such crises do not come along every day. Historically, they're quite rare. They represent hinge points in capitalism's history, decision moments when the shape of social life is up for grabs. At such times, the burning question is, who will succeed in constructing a viable counter-hegemony, and on what basis? Who, in other words, will guide the process of social transformation, in whose interest and to what end? As we saw, the process whereby general crisis leads to societal reorganization has played out several times in modern history, largely, if not exclusively, to capital's benefit. Through this process, capitalism has reinvented itself again and again. Seeking to restore profitability, its champions have redrawn the economy polity division, reconfiguring not only the political system, but also the official economy, social reproduction, and our relation to non-human nature. In so doing, they have reorganized not only the mode of political domination, but also the established forms of exploitation and expropriation, hence class domination, status hierarchy, and political subjection and asymmetry. Reinventing domination anew, they have often managed to channel rebellious energies into new hegemonic projects that overwhelmingly benefit who else but capital. Will this process be repeated today? The struggle to resolve the present democratic crisis, like that crisis itself, can neither be sectoral nor freestanding. Far from concerning political institutions alone, it poses the most fundamental and general questions of social organization. Where will we draw the line, delimiting economy from polity, society from nature, production from reproduction? How will we allocate our time among work and leisure, family life, politics, and civil society? How will we use the social surplus we collectively produce? And who exactly will decide these matters? Will the profit makers manage to turn capitalism's contradictions into new opportunities for accumulating wealth? Will they co-opt important strands of rebellion, even as they reorganize social domination? Or will, to use a phrase of Walter Benjamin, a mass uprising of capital finally be the act by which the human race traveling in the train applies the emergency brake? Like that wonderful quote from his thesis on history. Well, the answer depends, at least in part or to some degree, on how we understand the present crisis. If we stick to familiar politicist interpretations, we will construe democracy's travails as a freestanding species of political trouble. We will moralize about the need for civility, bipartisanship, and respect for the truth, while missing the deeper issues and sources of trouble. Sailing high-mindedly above the benighted deplorables who object to capital's predations, we will discount the legitimate grievances of those critical masses across the globe who are now rejecting neoliberalism. We will, in effect, render ourselves irrelevant in the present struggle to build a counter-hegemony. The alternative, which I have proposed here, only in the most, well, not in any detail to be sure. The alternative is to view democracy's current travails as expressing deep-seated contradictions built into the institutionalized structure of capitalism, hence as a strand of the general crisis of that social order. This interpretation affords no easy answers, to be sure, but it has the signal merit of pointing us in what I at least think is the right direction, challenging us to reimagine, if not to abolish, the dysfunctional anti-democratic social order that is contemporary financialized capitalism. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Yes.
Don't come back? Okay.
Nancy, this was a masterful analysis that's connecting so many levels and that leaves us with the message of hope, which I think many of us would like to believe. So I'm sure that the audience has many questions. So we now have time for a good, healthy exchange. So the floor is open. Who's going to take the first one? Yes, go ahead, and please mention your name first.
Yeah, Rosanna Castiglioni from the David Rockefeller Center and also from Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. I think I will ask a politicist type of question, okay. So I hope that's okay. The first, you said that capitalist democracy is shaky. But I wonder if there is democracy without capitalism, if we can think of examples in which we know it works. I frankly, I'm terrified about risking democracy. Right. I really can't get rid of capitalism, but what about democracy? So is there any risk on eliminating capitalism? And the other question I wanted to ask had to do with capitalism tends to bite its tail, which I think you're absolutely right, and is a very provocative idea. But what about thinking about rebuilding our states in a way that we improve state capacity and regulation?
In a way that will what?
Improve state capacity and regulation in order to control in a better manner capitalism.
Got it. Great. Shall I reply? Yeah. Thank you very much. They're both truly excellent questions. And of course, you're exactly right to ask, even if I'm right, that a secure and robust democracy worthy of the name is very difficult, if not impossible, to come by within a capitalist framework. It could still be the case that there's no other framework in which it could exist either. So then we're back to the idea that not democracy, but capitalism is the worst, but yet at the same time, right, the only or best form of organization. And it's obviously the case that the history of really existing socialism does not inspire great confidence. I completely concede that point. It would be foolish to deny it. But I think I will make two kinds of answers here. One is, I would not rule out the possibility of the invention of some kind of new form of capitalism that would provide a space for a certain form of democracy, somewhat reduced compared to the more ambitious vision that I have, and but also confined, I would say, to wealthier populations and regions and majority ethnic people within them and so on. So in other words, I wouldn't say that we couldn't have some sort of, again, what I would call, poor form of democracy, but maybe it deserves a name, for some strain of the people that could last for some set of decades until what I'm claiming is that these contradictions are there. They're not always acute. These various regimes are ways of provisionally stabilizing things, of defusing them, of displacing them, sometimes onto other populations, and so on. So we could have a new form of capitalist democracy. It's hard for me to imagine what it would be in the light of other things going on, like global warming and the So, and I firmly believe that this would be a topic for a whole nother lecture, that global warming is not soluble within a capitalist framework. That I'm even more sure about. So I think at this point, we don't have a choice. I don't want to give up. And we can be agonistic, I don't mean agonistic, I mean agnostic. We can be agnostic. We can say, we don't know for sure whether what we're going to end up with will be some new, kinder, gentler, somewhat more democratic form of capitalism, or whether it will be something beyond capitalism. But we'll see how much we can do within capitalism. The reason that it's so difficult, and this gets to your second point about rebuilding state capacities and regulatory forces and so on, I suspect that the genie of so-called globalization is so far out of the bottle that we now have a very great mismatch of scale between political powers, even those of relatively stable and wealthy and well-armed states, let's say, potentially competent states, even those are not able, to impose a global Tobin tax, or, just think of the sort of things you would need to get these out of control forces back within some form of political control. So I'm not suggesting that we need a world state or something like that. I do think we need some kinds of global powers for some purposes. And so I'm not an anarchist. I'm definitely in favor of state-like public powers. I think they're essential not only in capitalism, but in any any desirable and reasonable form of social organization. But I don't see any way back to Keynesian Fordist social democracy. The promise to bring back manufacturing to the United States is a total scam, clearly. So I'm for taking the risk. Personally, I'm not arguing the case exactly here, but my own personal partisan hunch is some form of democratic socialism, but we don't even know what that means. We have to figure out what that means. And it is not going to eliminate markets, believe me. It's going to have some sort of role for markets, but just not at the level in which markets decide all these very fundamental overarching things.
Okay, so many hands have raised. So there's Frank Dobbin, Cornel West, Muli Hisham, and I believe Michael Fisher there. So let's start with Frank. And since there's going to be many more hands, I suggest you keep your question a little short so we can cover more.
If you want to group them, that's okay with me. Yeah.
Frank.
Frank Dobbin, Sociology. I want to bring you back to Polanyi and try to ask you if there isn't a perhaps more dystopian future ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you make a strong case for the 19th century division between the economy and the polity, but that happened only in a very small part of the world.
Right.
Most of the world never saw that. In most of the world, the economy and the polity are one. That is, the economic leaders run the polity, right. And where the polity disagrees with them, there's a coup. So this is one of 90 questions I had, and I won't ask the other 89. But
that one I completely agree with.
But could we not go in their direction rather than them coming in our direction?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So let me group three very different questions.
Well, can I just answer that one really fast? I think, of course we could. I'm not making predictions. This could all, and it is going horribly badly. And it could get worse. But, as a kind of intellectual and a citizen, what do we do but try to, give it our best shot at sort of figuring out what's going on, and then trying in addition to, for me anyway, I'm not saying everyone has to do this, but trying in addition to a kind of, I hope, semi-scholarly analysis, also speaking as a citizen or a public intellectual. Michelle mentioned that I have just written, I'm so, motivated, yeah, that's the word. As much by fear as by hope, it has to be said. I'm so motivated that I have, for the first time in maybe 30 or 40 years, tried to do a sustained piece of agitational writing. And I hope I'm not making a big, embarrassing fool out of myself by doing so. But I have co-authored with two other feminist colleagues this manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto. And it's an attempt to sort of show how, at least from the gender angle, how a feminist response that would not be lean in, crack the glass ceiling feminism, but something that really took all this into account.
Okay, Cornell, and then Malia Shah.
He was ahead of me.
Okay, go ahead, Malia Shah.
I'll speak right now. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for that magisterial tour de force.
A little bit louder. You're not in the mic. Mic isn't.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's still not
It's
working.
not working. Oh, here we are. It's working now. Thank you. So my question is as follows. Towards the end of your talk, you thought that this was a critical moment that offered opportunities for an alternative. I would like to share your optimism, but my question is the following: where do you see this optimism? The reaction to this are populisms, and they are about attacking elites, but they are about doing so by drawing parallels and going to communitarian and very divisive groups. And that's for one, and also they are about attacking rule of law. They are the very tools we have to challenge this. They're about creating unanimisms and plebiscitarian tactics to divide and rule and basically subvert the very process that's supposed to empower an alternative. So where does your optimism come from? Thank you.
Good.
Handle another one?
Should I?
Cornell?
Let me just say that it's just such a blessing to hear your grand narrative. You one of the last grand critical theorists and left philosophers who could still totalize in that way, with analytical content and emancipatory character to it. Two quick questions connected to my dear brother's question. Why Polanyi rather than Gramsci?
Why Polanyi? Oh.
Rather than Gramsci in terms of the contradiction, the relation between economy and polity, economy and society,
Good.
and even culture. And is there a difference that makes a difference here? It seems to me it has something to do, I think, with what the scope of your emancipatory utopian projection would be. And that another way of asking that question is, how is your project in the end the difference that makes a difference? Different than Sheldon Wolden's Fugitive Democracy, in which that dystopia, that inverted totalitarianism, the neo-fascism articulated in new forms in relation to a globalizing, financialized capital that does not have any potent counter-hegemonic forces. And when they are oppositional, they tend to be captured by neo-fascist strong men, toxic masculinity. We can go down. So that has something to do also with the psyche, something to do with culture, something to do with what some of us would call the existential capitals that's operating. But it's just a blessing to see somebody keeping alive the legacy of critical theory and left philosophy in such a bleak moment, I must say.
You're among my inspirations, Cornell, for sure. Well, let me first say, in a way, you're both really asking very closely related questions. I want to say, first of all, that I'm not sure that I would sign on to the characterization of optimistic. I guess in at least one sense of Gramscianism, you could say pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I mean, this isn't, the picture I've sketched is not a pretty picture. And I've elsewhere written about the other side of this. I called this the structural side of the story, but then there's also the hegemonic crisis side, the responses, the various political, what's happening in precisely the crack up of all the established political classes, the rejection of elites, and so on. And so I'm interested in both sides, and I'm going to just plead, what's the word? I'm not going to say optimism or pessimism. But I do think that it's not as one-sidedly bad as either of you have suggested, and certainly not as the Sheldon Wolin story. I would say that we have both left and right-wing populist responses. By the way, I do not accept the Jan Werner Müller liberal conception that all populism is simply demagogy and so on. I think there are better and worse forms of populism. In that sense, I'm a neo-Gramscian following Ernesto Laclau. And so I think, there are different populisms, and we need, and I could say a bit more about how we would distinguish them, but let me not get into that now. So I think I would say that we not only had obviously this Trumpian moment in that 2016 election, even if you go back to the election, let alone what's happened since, this was the most remarkable collapse that in the space of just a few months of the entire establishment of the Republican Party. It was astounding. And let's not forget the Bernie Sanders phenomenon on the other side, which did not succeed, but had, I think, the capacity, it was trying at least and coming reasonably far along to accomplishing something similar on the Democratic side. So in other words, I'm saying, I really mean it, that we should not look only at the worst of the worst, and that exists. No one wants to minimize that. But let's also look at the indignados in Spain. Let's look at what's happening with Corbyn and the British Labour Party, the Scottish National Party. I mean, there are other things happening now. Even something like the Five Star Movement in Italy is not simply a right-wing, racist populist party. It's a more complicated mix of things. And so if you're an optimist of the will, even if you're a pessimist of the intellect, you have to, I think, start with the assumption that not the card-carrying racists and homophobes and anti-immigrants, but there's a chunk, a sizable chunk of people who might be drawn even to right-wing populism, who can be wooed. And I think that's what Sanders has tried to do. And I think where there is some kind of, let's call it a left populist alternative, then there's a chance. I can't make the calculus and say who will win and so on. But there are lots of things, even in the United States. The fact that 8.5 million people who voted for Trump also voted for Obama twice. These are not principled racists. They may be opportunistic racists, but they are potentially reachable. And that's what I mean. You might have caught the edge in some of the text where I'm talking about the the high-minded moralizing. This is what turns those people off, and rightly so. What my idea is, don't close ranks with the neoliberals. That's what they're inviting all of us Democrats and progressives to do. Don't close ranks with them. We might have to do that if the brown shirts are really at the door, but they're not yet. Don't close ranks with them. Try this other, more offensive strategy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes? Go ahead.
Dara Grant from the Committee on Degrees in Social Studies. So as I was listening to your grand narrative, which I agree was a pleasant thing to be reminded of, I couldn't help but think that when Marx in 1843 writes on the Jewish question, he begins his critical project with precisely the critique of the separation of the public and private sphere and moves from there to political economy. So the theoretical gesture you're making throughout the talk, it seems to me, has been in Marxian thinking from the beginning. And the doubt that I have, I suppose, the concern, is that if we're in a situation of generalized crisis, at least part of what that generalized crisis is an intellectual crisis, and that intellectual crisis touches the left as much as it touches the right. And so I wonder what your narrative would have to say to folks like David Scott or the late Stuart Hall or the late Moishe Postone, who would want to argue that there's something in our critical concepts that we're deriving from the Marxian tradition that simply no longer has a yield on the present in the way that it did at one point. And if you look to the British project, John McDonnell's economic policy, or the Sanders program, it very much does look like an effort to recover some kind of social democratic or state capitalist project. Now, if that's already yielded the crisis we're in, then what are the critical resources we have to move from this moment to whatever's going to come afterwards? And what reckoning does there need to be on the intellectual left with our categories and with a willingness to recognize that some of those categories simply have to be dispensed with if we're to move beyond the current moment?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Vivian Shaw, and I'm in the Weatherhead Center in the U.S.-Japan program. So my question is about the diagnosis of crisis. And as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about Janet Reuteman's work on crisis. Yeah. And so in which she's arguing, I feel like I'm echoing, in which she's arguing that the narrativization of crisis can in some ways conceal the system working as it should. So I think that your discussion of the inherent contradictions of different forms of capitalism, I think, is really useful in addressing that. But I think part of what your last part of the talk was mentioning was how there is a danger in relying on the narrative of crisis to then not problematize the system as a whole, because a crisis kind of then gets seen as an acute moment in time rather than a system. So my question is about that. So what are your thoughts on that? And similarly, you speak about a critical mass that is required in order to diagnose crisis, right? But how does that mass get formed? Because we have, of course, when the system works as it should, you have very large populations that are living in constant states of crisis. So then which are the groups of people, or what are the populations that are then able to locate that a crisis is happening, and what are the, how do you see the sort of power differentials inherent within that process? Thank you.
Okay, let's take the third one, and then I'll ask you to respond.
My name is Marcy Murninghan, and I'm an anxiety-ridden optimist from Michigan.
Okay,
And
right, aren't
I've
we
been
all?
affiliated with Harvard for about 43 years. Doctoral work, as I worked directly on the Boston School desegregation case, and then went from race and schooling to race and money, and have spent the last 35 years with stints teaching at Harvard Divinity School, courses on money and morality, and doing a lot of projects there, to stuff at the Kennedy School on the use of social media for corporate accountability. I'm here to say there are opportunities for positive action. And in fact, that's something I'm working on. And there is a very large infrastructure out there that is redefining capitalism through the lens of fiduciary responsibility. That the essential role, and there are centuries of wisdom on the part of religious and philosophical traditions regarding the civic moral obligations of wealth. Just as Reinhold Niebuhr warned us 83 years ago that political power essentially derives from economic power, we can use the tools of capitalism to fix the abuses of capitalism by connecting prophecy to pragmatism. Prophesy deliverance.
Right.
By connecting prophecy to pragmatism through grassroots organizing around leveraging vast pools of financial wealth held by tax-exempt institutional investors in ways that advance the public interest. So anybody who's interested in that, I'm happy to talk, but it really is within our reach without new laws or without other sorts of, things that are beyond our reach.
Okay. Well, I got a big job here. So I very much agree with you that a strand of this general crisis involves what you could call a crisis of political imagination, a crisis of intellectual paradigms, and dare I say, without meaning it's at all to be self-praise, that I think the retreat from big picture thinking is a symptom of this crisis. I think the times demand it. I may not do it as well as I would like, and it's risky. You know, there are all kinds of people who could object to every sentence who know a lot more than I do on this point or that point. But it's true that we've disabled some of our critical tools. Now, on the more specific things, I would just say that for me, Marx remains indispensable. And I'm one of these people who, despite the clear anti-Semitic tones, will defend the essay on the Jewish questions in terms of its fundamental conceptual argument, which you're right, has some affinities with what I've said here. And I've learned a lot from Moishe Postone and some of the other people that you've mentioned. But the Marxism of Marx is, I sometimes call myself a Marxist. Then I've written a paper called Why Two Karls Are Better Than One, because I think Polanyi is extremely important, and I've tried to sort of figure out how to synthesize them. And yes, Gramsci is another leading star, and I'm a feminist, and I'm now trying to learn about eco-Marxism and eco-social. So, I mean, there's so much. We have some great critical paradigms that are a little too sectoral, and for me, the problem, and that's what I meant about an enlarged conception of what capitalism is, an enlarged conception of what its crisis. To me, this is all a way of a work of integration of different paradigms, but I would not throw out Marx. I'd figure out how to get those other hidden abodes into the picture and so on and so forth. I agree with you also, even though I've just praised them, and I do respect them tremendously. I would say both Sanders and Corbyn have a whiff of the anachronistic about them. And it's absolutely true that we do not have a real project, a real picture of what the good society we want is like. And it's not Denmark, as Bertie sometimes says when he's asked to explain what democratic socialism is. I'm interested in whether it's possible to develop some version of market socialism that also brings in elements of cooperative or économie sociale et solidaire. There's a lot going on. Maybe this is partly what you're talking about. There's a lot of sort of experimentation, co-op and commoning, and so on and so forth. Usually, because it's disconnected from a real analysis of the overall system of power, it can end up just being a coping mechanism or, something that, but there's also a lot to learn there. So I think that it remains to be invented and that we need to overcome whatever the psychological and other kinds of blocks are that prevent us from thinking about these things. Well, as you would guess, I don't agree with Janet Reutman in the sense that I think I would distinguish between loose crisis talk, which is rampant. There's a crisis in doping in international sports. There's a crisis here. But let's distinguish that from a properly social theoretical understanding of crisis, by which I mean the accumulation of dysfunctions and bads that are generated non-accidentally by virtue of the constitutive dynamics or institutional forms of a social organization. That's what I mean by crisis. That's why the term contradiction is important to me, although I realize it has a very old lefty kind of sound. I do appreciate, though, the point that crisis talk can be recuperated. I think this is what Naomi Klein's shock doctrine is all about, right? However, I would have been very happy to see a little bit of shock doctrine from the left on the part of our friend Barack Obama when he took office, where there was a kind of moment where I believe that with respect to financial regulation and there were things and the total discrediting of the invasion of Iraq and so on, I think there were opportunities actually to do bigger things, which would have been maybe a shock doctrine from the other side. So it is recuperable, but there's also a serious social scientific or social theoretical concept of crisis that is indispensable in my view. How does a critical mass form? Oh my God. I have no idea. I mean, why did it take until 2015-16 for, people to stop, going along with the neoliberal program? I have no idea. What's the straw that breaks the camel's back? I suspect that there were these sort of precursor moments, including the 2008 election of Obama, which was a kind of a cry for change, however amorphous the idea of change are being articulated was. I think that Occupy in 2011 was also, and especially the kind of very widespread approval it generated among sections of the population that you wouldn't have expected. And then finally this election. So I don't know why it happens when, but the other point that you raise, which I think is a great point, is about who counts in the question of declaring a crisis. Because there are all kinds of poor brown and black people all over the world who could have told us decades ago that there was a crisis. But it doesn't, they are discounted precisely for these reasons about power asymmetry. Sadly, it's not until voters in centers of power reject their rulers and parties that, that people wake up and say, uh-oh, maybe there's a crisis. So that's, and I would say that capitalism, it's as a system historically, or capital as a force within the system, has always played the game of pacifying those people whose defection might really upset the apple cart by offloading the real extreme bads onto those who don't count on the other side of the world. So we can take wealth stolen from them and create, a nice social welfare state for white people, and yeah.
Great. Diane Davis?
Yeah, hi. I'm affiliated with Weatherhead Center. Nancy, if you remember me, I taught with
It's
you
so great to see you.
a while back at the New School. What an amazing talk, and it was really great hearing you. Very, very energizing. I guess I want to say that I don't need to be convinced there's a crisis, and I guess I want to focus a question that structures more around action, because I think what you're saying is that optimistic, pessimist is the only recourse is to act.
Right.
And you need a vision for acting, which is kind of what you're saying. So, but my question is, can you talk a little more about the scale of the action?
Good.
So, what struck me about your wonderful overview of millennia, centuries of crises from mercantilism to the present, is that was a story that had a territoriality,
Right.
a kind of moving between cities and countryside, nations and the globe and back, through all these periods of the emergence of the nation state, etc. But I think that we can't move forward on action until we have a better understanding of the present crisis with respect to the territoriality of where it's most felt, where it's felt most extremely. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, it's interesting that many of the examples, positive and negative, but of all the positive examples, there's kind of a methodological nationalism. Yeah. You've talked about the populism of the you listed about 4 nations. Right. Whether it's, Corbyn, the Denmark, Mexico. I work on Mexico, so we're happy to have left populace in Mexico.
Of course.
But I'm just wondering whether we could actually think that we can move beyond neoliberalism or this current crisis of capitalism with a focus on kind of national politics, and whether we need to be thinking more at the subnational level or even transnational. I guess I want to throw the territoriality, because all the contradictions you mentioned were iterations of changing territorial relationships. So just if you could speak a little about that, it'd be great.
Fabulous question.
Okay, one more there.
Hi, I'm Katrina Forrester, Assistant Professor in Government and Social Studies. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to pick up on something you said about populism. I know you said you were getting away from Jan Werner Muller's account of populism. But I wondered, at a number of points you suggested that maybe we are seeing a revolt against neoliberalism, a right populist revolt against neoliberalism. But I wonder whether we might characterize this more as a revolt within neoliberalism, so racial, authoritarian neoliberals. And I wondered what your move to go away from neoliberalism towards returning to capitalism whether that might allow us to characterize that better, or whether you thought that actually we should be seeing this as right populism against neoliberalism. So, thank you.
Good question. I don't know the answer. Shall I? Okay. Diane, thank you. It's great to see you and to listen to you. As usual, you go to the core of the difficulty. And I would simply say that I think I may not have adequately nuanced the complexities of territoriality and trans-territoriality in that short-potted summary of previous regimes, because I guess someone like Hannah Arendt is very useful to think about. I mean, that's another example of a political, another diagnosis of how capitalism has a political contradiction in that era. It's the section on imperialism in the origins of totalitarianism. It's an underappreciated and understudied text. I don't particularly like some of the other chapters, but that section is really good because she has the idea that, and I don't agree with this starting point, but her starting point is that politics is and must be territorial, and that what happens with imperialism, which is a non-accidental consequence of the inherent expansionist thrust and growth thrust of capitalist economy, what happens with imperialism is that in a sense, it kind of boomerangs back on the integrity of the territorial polity by hooking it up with this exercise in trans-territorial domination. The specifics may not be perfect, but what it suggests is that even earlier, you've got capitalism has never been national. It's always been a way of somehow mediating a set of, let's say, more capitalistically organized or integrated polities vis-a-vis a larger space, which in some cases may be like direct rule colonialism they've got some other direct political relationship with, although not a relation of citizenship and ruler, or there may be various forms of indirect, which are not overtly political at all. But I think that capitalism has always had to mediate this inside-outside problem. And really what I saw as I was listening to myself, that, I mean, what I was saying about mercantile capitalism was that it ran afoul of the inside-outside. It wasn't able to keep them separate. And maybe if I thought more about it, I would have some analogous formulations about each of the other things. I think this is a persistent, recurring aspect of what it means to say that there's a political crisis tendency in it. And it simply has to do with what Emanuel Wallerstein has always said, that capitalism is it's a world economic system that's superimposed onto a multi-state political order, and that's a formula for trouble, right? And there might be temporary fixes and ways of sort of diffusing it, but it kind of it keeps coming back in one form or another. So for today. I do not mean to endorse methodological nationalism or that the scale of action can and must only be national. But on the other hand, that is where our politics lives. And when we act as citizens in anything remotely resembling a democratic polity, we are engaged in electoral contests and other kinds of battles over state power or the various, other related levers. So you can't avoid that. The trick is probably to combine action at multiple scales. We had these alter globalization activists, which kind of, evaporated at a certain moment. Probably they would say because the war of terror kind of stole their I said war of terror, right? That's Borat. The war on terror or of terror, whatever you want to call it, stole their space. But that was an important arena to contest these global financial institutions. I think that's very, very important. But to test it not in a way that is aimed at, as someone like Wolfgang Streeck, let's get the Deutschmark back. And, that's. So I would say a both and especially a sense of the permeability and intersection of the various scales at which different powers and different kinds of powers are exercised. Those are the powers that have to be held to account. And since the powers that we need to hold to account exist at multiple scales and intersect one another in complex ways, the struggle against them has to be similarly multi-scaled and intersecting. That's the best I can do. The last, is it the last? Populist revolt either against or within neoliberalism. So, I mean, part of the issue here is that populist revolts form in response to emergent leaders who seem to hold out projects that, in some case, as Trump, adopt an anti-neo. It's amazing how much, if you think back to his presidential campaign, how much of Sanders' language he took. He started talking about the rigged economy and so on. So he was using a lot of populist accents. Of course, the second he got into office, that disappeared. It was just, the caravan, the travel ban, all of those tropes, and plus the tax cut for the rich. There was never a serious attempt to pursue infrastructure, which might have been, some way of reaching out to the working class segment of his voting base. So the problem is we have politicians who galvanize or become the sort of focal points of, let's say, right-wing populist revolts or any populist revolts, and then in power, they govern differently. It's a bait and switch. So neoliberal policy continues with barely missing a beat. I mean, this renegotiation of NAFTA, it's a complete smoke and mirrors job. It doesn't actually in any way protect workers any more than the previous version. So, I would say that at their best, in the sense of most promising, populist revolts are or have the capacity to become genuinely anti-neoliberal, but that they are subject to all this recuperation, which Trump has so masterfully orchestrated to just amplify the most retrograde sort of racist politics of misrecognition, while forgetting altogether, let's say, with the economic face of the grievances. And so that ends up being within neoliberalism. I mean, I've argued that that Trump campaigned as a reactionary populist or anti-neoliberal, but has governed as a hyper-reactionary neoliberal. And so there are many ways of putting together, this is another Gramscian point about the articulation, can articulate a politics of recognition of either an emancipatory or a deeply regressive kind with a politics of distribution that is either plutocratic or, semi-redistributive or whatever. So we're seeing lots of different mixes of these things, with the issue of immigration now always at the center, increasingly, everywhere. Did I miss something, or was that it?
Anyone else? Okay. Yes, there's one person there and one there. Go ahead. And Jenny Mansbridge as well. Maybe we'll collect those three and then we'll conclude. Jenny is hiding there.
I didn't see it.
Go ahead.
Oh, all right. Thank you for that. I'm Wilbur. I'm in the economics department. I have a question about so you talked about the 4 regimes of capitalism, and the 4 regimes you chose were increasingly short. The first was 2 centuries. The second was like 1.5, maybe 50 years for the third, less for the fourth. I'm interested in whether you think that's an artifact of the way we do history in hindsight, whether we can see subtle distinctions in the more recent past, or whether you think there's something real to the pace of history becoming more rapid. And if the latter, whether that implies anything about capitalism's capacity to reform and survive this crisis, whether there will be another crisis in the next 10 or 20 years.
Right. Very interesting.
Hi, Nancy. I'm Jane Mansbridge. I teach over at the Kennedy School. Nancy, I wonder if you would entertain the idea of replacing, socializing the means of production with taxation. And let me just spell this out a tiny bit. Back in 1848, state penetration wasn't anything like what it is now. I think perhaps, I don't know how many people in this room think we can socialize the means of production and be efficient. I think that we need quite a bit of free market going on to be efficient. If we were to accept that, then another way of approaching the problem would be to use what we now have in the way of government power, namely the power to tax, to think of an alternative universe. So, for example, it's true that Denmark is small and so forth and so on, but people pay 50% of their income in taxes in Denmark and say this is what but look what we get for it. I think your point about if we go back to Marx's concept of the surplus and think that we collectively have created all this, sort of how do we want to manage it? One way we could manage it is, all right, have some free market and so forth, and then tax madly. A tax for us, tax us for us. And financial transaction taxes could also help fund international work. So if we were to creatively adopt the taxation regime as a future way of thinking of building, it might be better than gesturing back to 1848 and some of the ideas at that time. So what do you think about that? Using taxation as something that would actually use the power of the state that has been created in part by capital, no question, but it's also been created by us to do the things we want to have done.
Okay, so one last short question, Jed, there.
Thanks, Jed Schwartz. I'm a self-published. You seem to be. It's an impressive lecture. I followed your work on unpaid women, and with great appreciation. But I'm afraid that I'm reluctant to sign on to a galvanic revolution. At this point, probably forever, but I don't know about that. But you seem to be conceptualizing the situation as a conflict between a capitalist system and a new replacement system, which would be socialist, I suppose. But I'm suggesting that I'd like to suggest that another way of looking at it is to compare conflicts of sectoral, institutional definitions of the situation or frames, conflicting frames. As you can fight, you can fight with by deconstructing the frames of your opponent. By saying they say you mean freedom, but this is what you really mean. And I realize that the media is reluctant to do anything like that, and at least, and I don't think that they're the fake media, but they're all we have, and they are biased in favor of the status quo. There's no question about it, and that's unfortunate.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. So on the first question about sort of historical speed up, I really don't know what to say. I have no idea whether that's some coincidence or whether it means something. I don't know. Do you? That's really worth thinking about, though, because I would hate to conclude that that there was some teleological thing that was just every fix is getting shorter and shorter until the whole that is not kind of congenial to me, but it's an interesting observation. I will think more about it. Jenny, it's so nice to see you. Well, listen, I didn't actually speak about socializing ownership of the means of production, and I'm entirely in favor of the kind of taxation you're talking about. I think that, the whole question of property, and let's say we're talking about, if we can still use this language, property in the means of production, although a lot of it is algorithms and God knows what. It's not like a factory anymore. We have now this sophisticated work from legal scholars about the bundle of different rights that are all somehow mixed together in various notions of property. And so you can unbundle these things and say, you'd have to ask which of those rights we really want to vest in owners or in the idea of ownership itself, and which not. Does being the owner mean that you should have essentially unchallengeable right to dictate the organization of work of your workers, or do they have any rights in that? That would be one kind of question. Do you have the right to appropriate as private wealth all of the surplus, or all of the surplus minus some taxed form, et cetera, et cetera? There are different ideas here, and I'm very, very open to the taxation thing. I don't think that socialism today has to mean abolishing all private property. It might just mean changing what rights property gives you, but I guess the question of scale matters. If we're talking about a bookstore, or a restaurant, or the sort of consumer goods versus whether we're talking about agribusiness, massive industrialized farming of animals, where these pig lots run for miles and miles, belching methane into the, I think there are questions about whether those things should even exist. And to say that someone owns them and therefore can make them exist is already begging a question, let's say. So there's that point. And then there are all these models, though, also of a form of real collective ownership. Not just the Denmark tax model, but the Norwegian sovereign oil fund, all of the revenue from which is used in public interest projects. There's the Alaska model, in which the revenue is given out individually, which maybe some of that is worth something, but probably I like the Norwegian thing better. But then there's a whole problem about whether only the people who belong to that jurisdiction should have a claim on that, or the issue of the luck of being on a resort, born into a place that is resource rich versus not. There's so many complicated questions here. The other thing I would want to say is about finance. I think finance should be a public good. The idea that finance is run as a profit business, so that lenders allocate money for various projects in terms solely as to what return they will get. This skews the entire course of development. there are all kinds of worthwhile things that might not generate a return to a private investor that should be funded. So, electricity used to be in many places a public good. And there are some interesting proposals being worked out by people like Robin Blackburn, or even, from what I understand, I don't know the details, the Corbyn think tank itself, whose motto is rebalancing the economy, cutting down the weight of finance in relation to other sectors, doing something different with finance. Part of it is this idea of finance as a public good, that there have to be some kind of boards that allocate credit that have representation, not from the owners of the funds, but from people who are represented. So I don't have a dogmatic I don't know enough about this stuff. And I'm not wedded, certainly not wedded to a 19th century definition of socialism. But I think there are lots of possibilities to explore, including maybe some that you're talking about. Okay, and there's one more question. Yeah, about...
You want to go to Albania?
Conflicting frames, yeah. Well, of course, I'm for ideology critique. You say you're for freedom, but look at what you mean, the freedom of the already powerful to oppress the others, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, I'm for that. I don't think that's a alternative to the kind of programmatic thinking that we've just been trying to engage in here, even on the fly, about what would either, whether you want to call it a democratic socialist or a new mixed form of economy, polity. And one thing I'm very sure about is that any reflection about all these questions of, which are usually called questions of political economy, have to include social reproduction and ecology. We can't define those things out of the picture anymore. That's what I mean by an enlarged conception of capitalism. It's not just the economy and the state. All right, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. I think that Cornell expressed a general feeling very well when he said that this is a marvelous, capacious, daring picture, and I think that that's exactly the kind of talk we needed at this point. So go vote.
Yeah. Indeed. Great.